Lake George Battlefield Moments, a production of the Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance, preserving our area's incredible history. A weekly feature on 93.5 FM and live streaming at lakefm.com. Here's the president of the Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance, John Denuzzo.
Welcome to Lake George Battlefield Moments. This is John Denuzzo of the Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance Board of Trustees. Our guest this week is John Strough, well-known area public official and a historian, specialty in the region's colonial wars history. John's a lifetime member of the Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance. Welcome, John.
Thank you.
Okay, well, we started talking about Blind Rock on the radio segment. When did you first learn about Blind Rock?
I first learned about Blind Rock in the mid-'60s. My grandfather owned all the property on both sides of Route 9. And as you know, it's changed a lot since the 60s. But we had horses, and that was part of a pasture land. And it required fixing the fences for the horses and so forth. And I remember one day I was fixing one of the fence bullards, and my grandfather was sitting on the rock, and he says, "Johnny, do you know the history of this rock?" I said, "Gramps, no, I don't." His name was V.W. Weeks. And then he told me the history. You know, similar to what I introduced when I read the quotes of two historians. It was a place of extreme interest, and it was a place that was well known by all. I mean, early on, when more people seemed to be interested in history, the wagon carrying passengers from Glens Falls to Lake George would make stops at historical places. Blind Rock was one of their stops, where they would talk about that spot being a marker between the French in the north and the English in the south. You know, this is also called by David Starbuck and others the Great Warpath. And we've always called Fort Edward the Great Carrying Place. But there was never a name for that 14-mile trek between the Hudson River and Lake George. I call it the Great Carry. Midway in that Great Carry sits Blind Rock. And it played a very significant role in terms of it was a location marker for the Europeans when they came here. But previous to that, it sat on that major Great War path, but it also was a corner of a great crossroads. There was another path, not talked about as much, that went from the east to the west. So this sat on the corner of two great crossroads. And for the Native Americans, it was a place for meeting. And it was also a place to know your orientation, because the split rock is very unusual looking. And like us, Native Americans, we love our rocks. I mean, even the Oneida people of the rock, people of the stone. And I can make multiple references to Native Americans who picked out stones, not only for navigation, but also for spiritual significance. So as I read to you, this was a meeting place, and it was a place of other things, such as the historians talked about, inventive torture. One of the inventive tortures was blinding their victims. So Blind Rock could have come from that inventive torture, or it could also have come from its location. It was an area that if you were going to attack, if you were going to apprehend somebody to steal from them, or whatever, you would hide in the woods at a crossroads because you doubled your potentials for locating there. So it could be a blind because people hid in the woods with the intent to capture others, or it could be Blind Rock because it was a place where that form of torture was held. They blinded their victims. And I could tell you stories about that were written by colonials at the time. But it was also called Bound Rock, Torture Rock, and other terms, that it was a place of, at least the lore says, a place of torture. But it's so well known and referred to by the early French and Indian War soldiers, and then it was referred to by colonial soldiers during the Revolutionary War. It was a known spot. So well known that when Abraham Wing came here to survey the property with the intent of creating the town of Queensbury back in 1762, they used Blind Rock for their fencing descriptions because it was a place that was so well known by everybody who came to this area.
I've been there, but for our listeners, what's the size of the rock itself?
The rock is a big granitic rock, about 7 foot in length, about 4 foot in width. It is split in the middle, about 12 inches of a gorge, and it is about 300 feet off of current Route 9. But originally, the military road went right next to it. And the military road basically followed the Native American path that preceded it. And then when Johnson came up and widened it for the sake of carrying artillery up to the southern end of Lake George, it was widened and improved. But the original Blind Rock was right next to the military road. Soldiers would refer to it as they went by it. It was also kind of like the halfway point, but it was also a marker, a boundary marker, the French to the north and the English to the south. If you notice, French Mountain, French Pond, the Lac du Saint-Sacrement, those are all French terms for geographic features north of the rock. Battle of Lake George in 1755, September 8th, Dieskau's Indians, Native American allies, were reluctant to attack Fort Edward because Fort Edward was south of Blind Rock, and that was legitimate British territory. So when Sir William Johnson came through in August and September of 1755, he ventured on to what the French considered their property. So that's one reason why this famous location was called the boundary marker.
Was that pretty universally recognized, I mean, even if informally, as the dividing line between the French and British?
It's a good question. The only thing I can tell you is that when Jeffrey Amherst came up in 1758 after Abercrombie's failure, he wrote in his diary as he passed the rock, "I just passed the bounds that used to be the boundary between the French in the north and the English in the south." I suppose we could argue about that wasn't the location, but many references were made that it was the location.
And I'm interested in following up what you said on the radio segment, basically that the military road, what became the military road from Fort Edward to the head of Lake George, north-south, but there was also a corresponding east-west that made it a crossroads, so to say. Where did that trail go, the one that went east-west?
They don't know for sure. They think it went as far as Utica and that area going west. I don't know going east the extent of it. But the original military road followed the valley. In other words, it crossed Halfway Brook about where Route 9 is today, and then it went to the right to go up to the valley where Pineview Cemetery is and Sweet Road, and then cut up that way. A lot of people like to think that Route 9 basically was the military road. In this case, it's not. The military road ventured in a different direction and went right by Blind Rock. And if you look at the geography, that makes a lot more sense, especially if you're porting artillery.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Is Blind Rock marked? I mean, if people want to see the Blind Rock themselves, can they view it?
Yeah, but there is a historic marker on the corner of the southern terminus of Monterey Road and Route 9, almost across from Walmart. If you go down the Monterey Road about 300 feet to the bottom of the hill, you can't miss it. It's on your left. I do put Blind Rock signs there. They get stolen. See, it's in an area that's not surveyed well by the public. I worked on purchasing the property when I worried about development getting to it. And so I sent my first letter to the owners of the property in 2007. Multiple letters occurred, negotiations occurred, And around 2010, I bought it for the town. It is now officially a municipally owned park.
And we're talking the town of Queensbury here, just as John said. The landmark Queensbury on Route 9, on the west side of Route 9, a little bit beyond that, on the east side of Route 9 will be that marker at the corner of Monterey Road on Route 9.
I'm working on putting another sign up, but I get frustrated.
Yeah.
You know, people do seances there and everything else. It has like this spiritual significance.
And is there a place to sit? All that people visit?
Yeah. We've had the Eagle Scout projects. We've had the Eagle Scouts clean it up and put protective barriers around it to prevent further sedimentation. Originally, when I was a kid, the rock sat on the surface. But now you'll see that we've had to dig in and around the rock to expose it to the way it was because of development fill. Mm. And I was worried that, Uno's Pizza and that piece of property, which was infill, would eventually cover blind rock. So starting in 1988, I started a Save the Rock program. I was with my daughter, and there's a nice picture of my daughter and I, who was like 2 years old at the time, sitting on top of Blind Rock, and there was an article in the Chronicle about Save the Rock. And that was 1988.
Wow.
Eventually, I saved the rock, and it's now a pocket park and protected forever.
Much to your credit. Well, thank you. If people have questions, they can certainly contact you. I wanted to send them to the info@lakegeorgebattlefield.org email, and I'll forward them to John. I did want to ask you, you alluded to briefly the Battle of Lake George itself, and a key part, the first skirmish in that took place in Queensbury, not too far from Blind Rock. Can you tell us about the Bloody Morning Scout, what the name means, where it is, and what people can see?
Yeah, well, that kind of ties in when I was talking about Dieskau and his French troops and his Native American allies progressing southward with the intent of stopping the British's movement northward. I mean, they went north of Blind Rock. So, the idea was to possibly attack Fort Edward. That was deterred and did not happen for two reasons. One, the Native Americans said, now, wait a minute, that's British territory. That's fair ground. Why are we attacking them? And not only then, many of their own allies were part of the British. They decided not to invade Fort Edward. Not only that, but there was a massive amount of soldiers there. It would be very difficult. And I think the Native Americans realized that. So they camped on the northeast side of Glen Lake, what we call Glen Lake. They called French Pond, and then decided that they would make an attack on Sir William Johnson, who had just days before created this road to better afford the tracking of artillery northward. And he did have artillery northward, and that would come into play later in the Battle of Lake George. But the first part of the Battle of Lake George, called the Battle of Bloody Morning Scout, was where Dieskau and his troops ambushed a southbound group of Williams's troops with King Hendrik, and there were bound to Fort Edward to help Fort Edward out should Dieskau. They were aware of Dieskau and the French troops in the area, but they didn't get very far before they were ambushed. And that was the first part of the Battle of Lake George, called Bloody Morning Scout.
And that's something people can visit. Just briefly tell us what's there if people go view it.
Well, you have this monument, which is interesting, located on top of a rock. See how these rocks play the significance in history. And again, the rock was portrayed as the last geographic piece that Ephraim Williams was on as he was shot in the head by the Dieskau ambush. And so he died suddenly, and then Hendrik's horse was shot out from under him, and he was easy prey for bayonets following that. So you have the loss of two major leaders, Ephraim Williams and King Hendricks, at this battle, and the British forces took a pretty good loss. Now, at the end of the day, I don't want to spoil all the fun, but the British would come out ahead on this deal.
Mm-hmm. And in fact, Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance members can participate in a tour of the 3 locations of the Battle of Lake George. We're doing that September the 14th. Members will get that information the rest of you should join the Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance to be able to see it. And John Strough will lead the part of the tour at the Bloody Morning Scout site. We've run out of time, John. Thank you. Hopefully have you back sometime.
I got a lot more to say.
I'm sure you do. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Remind everyone, our Battlefield Park Alliance website is lakegeorgebattlefield.org, and you can go to our YouTube channel anytime to see all the programs at Lake George Battlefield Moments. Thank you for being a part of our history.
Lake George Battlefield Moments, a production of the Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance, preserving our area's incredible history. For more on this topic, check out the Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance podcast, a weekly feature on Lake FM 93.5 FM and live streaming at lakefm.com. For more information, go to lakegeorgebattlefield.org and tune in every Saturday morning for Lake George Battlefield Moments.